In the last video, I talked about the best way to improve your Chinese. But the best way isn't the way that you'll use when you first begin. To take an example from weightlifting, the best way to improve leg strength is by squatting, sitting down with a heavy barbell on your back and standing back up. But many beginners aren't ready to squat from day one. They have to develop an intuitive feeling for the way their body works first. The equivalent in language learning is to develop an intuition for the music of the language. I use the word music intentionally, but I'll touch again on that in a bit. Let's go back to our weightlifting example to see if we can get any more clues about where we should begin when learning Chinese. So, where do weightlifters start? Perhaps your first thought is to think of those kinds of weight machines you often see in gyms. Beginners should start with simplicity and order, right? But this thought, in fact, is exactly wrong. In its heyday of the 1960s and 70s, more weightlifting champions came out of the Soviet system than from anywhere else. And the Soviet coaches believed that weightlifters should not specialize too soon. Instead, early on in their careers, athletes would spend a lot of time focusing on general physical preparation, things like gymnastics and playing team sports. Today, world-famous powerlifting coach Boris Sheiko uses the same principles training his champion lifters. Thus, an essential part of his beginners program is playing football. And football, of course, is not more simple or more ordered than barbell squats. Just the opposite, it is far more complex and chaotic. You see, you need to start not with order, but with randomness and chaos. When your body and mind interact with chaotic as opposed to ordered stimuli, they respond the only way they can, by building intuition, a subconscious instinct for the things that you are experiencing and how best to deal with them. This instinct then becomes the foundation for the order by which you systematize the things you've intuitively discovered later on. Put simply, you should start with exposure to everything, the chaos and randomness of the language as it's used out in the wild. Listen, preferably for hundreds of hours. Again, go into the real world and observe native speakers interact. When they talk to you, respond without thinking to their body language and intonation. You'll notice, just as an example, that you can always anticipate the punchline of a joke, without understanding any of the words. So don't worry about the pieces, that is, vocabulary and grammar, until a little bit later on. This idea is not just speculation. In the literature, what I've called intuition and interaction with chaos is termed implicit learning, whereas the combination of deliberate instruction, grammar drills, and vocabulary memorization, etc., is known as explicit learning. As Professor of Psychology and second language acquisition expert Nick Ellis has cogently argued, the vast majority of language learning is implicit. He and many other researchers in the field have described the difference between these two distinct but cooperative systems. On one hand, the implicitly learnt is a unified whole, blurry perhaps, but instinctively known and understood. Explicit learning, though, happens when we consciously recognize grammatical patterns and divide the language into meaningful chunks, such as words and phrases. What we've explicitly learnt is then integrated back into the implicit whole. You see, you have to have the whole in the first place in order for the implicit knowledge to have something to be integrated back into. We must begin with chaos. And if most of our learning is, and should be, implicit, is it not a mistake to apportion the lion's share of our learning time to exercises that only encourage the explicit? Of course, both of these systems are important, and I'll discuss explicit learning more in a later video. But as Ian McGilchrist explains in his excellent book on the differences between the brain's right and left hemispheres, the implicit and intuitive, associated with the right hemisphere, should be the master, and the explicit and systematic, associated with the left, the emissary, not the other way around. At the beginning of this video, I used the phrase "the music of the language" because I believe that in many ways language is just like music. You have to feel it. It's so much more than the sum of its parts. When overanalyzed, something, somehow, is lost. And, like getting to know a friend, as you intuitively become more familiar with a piece of music, or a language, your understanding and appreciation for it grows. As Michael Polanyi puts it, we can know more than we can tell. So, why start with just the pieces, when there is so much more to the whole?